Okay, good to know. Okay, we are going to make a start once Laura has been entirely in charge of all the technical elements this morning. If it goes wrong, we know how to play up. And there have been some challenges, so nice start, Laura. Are you kicking us off, or am I?
Yeah, I can kick us off, and then we will kind of just do brief introductions around the room. So, the Responsible Feedback Workshop, we've been doing it for just over a year now. So it was the idea of freedom and responsibility, and this workshop was introduced after the away day in March last year. And we've done probably about 5 or 6 now, so with different people leading them, so across the leadership group. And we've tweaked the slides a little bit. We've had feedback over the time that we've been doing it, and the reason that we ask everyone across Frontline to attend at least one of these workshops is so that we're all aligned on kind of where we stand on getting and receiving feedback in order to build the culture that we're after at Frontline. So with that in mind, I'll go to the people on the phone first. Just we've got quite a few new faces. I know it's someone's second day, no pressure. If you could just go around the phone. I'm just going to change screens, hopefully, and just say who you are, what you do, and if you could just let us know kind of how comfortable you feel giving feedback, or kind of what your experiences are, either in this role or any previous roles. Julie, I'm going to pick on you because you're top left on the screen. But you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi everyone.
Hi Julie.
Hi Julie.
You all right, Henry?
All right, Julie, how you doing?
Sorry, my sound went a little bit there. So what was it you wanted me to do? Just give about how I feel about giving feedback.
Yeah, what's your name? Well, obviously it's Julie, but what do you do? And yeah, your experience of giving feedback today.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie Henry, practice tutor in the North East. Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable about giving feedback. It's not something that particularly phases us, something that I have to do quite a lot in my role as a practice tutor when doing coaching sessions with CSWs and feedback to participants, and also within the team. We're quite good at giving each other constructive feedback. So yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with it.
Thank you. Azora, if we go to you next.
Okay, Azora Had, I'm in the Midlands region, and I'm the principal practice tutor here with lead responsibility for the Year 2 Masters, amongst other things, I think. I've only been with the organisation 7 months. I'm very comfortable at giving feedback generally because I've had a lot of leadership and management roles prior to joining Frontline. And I think because I was an academic, we always had to give feedback prior to my joining Frontline as well. And some of that feedback was face-to-face as well as doing assessments for students up to PhD level. So I'm quite comfortable about it. In relation to our team, I think that we've got some new members of the team that are joining us. We have looked at the rights and responsibilities. I've actually taken some leadership for that within the region to make sure it keeps up on the agenda and to go through the documentation. I think our head of region has been very instrumental for making sure that we try to implement some aspects of providing constructive and supportive feedback to one another by way of encouragement, as well as areas that we might need to look at for improvement. So yeah, I'm fairly comfortable with it.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Chris?
I've just tried to switch my camera on to shock you all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and I would echo really what Julie and Azora have said. So Chris Hensley, Principal Curriculum Lead for Year 1. I feel that I have a comfortable relationship with feedback. I think it's a two-way street. I expect to get it as well as to give it. In terms of, career before Frontline in social work, it was absolutely central to everything that you did with families, and the feedback you had to give was often emotionally very loaded and difficult for people to hear. It's not quite that tough. Hasn't been quite that tough within the organisation so far. But again, in terms of working with participants and with CSWs, there are often conversations that we have to have that require some careful navigating in order to give constructive feedback. And again, within teams and between teams too, I think it's central in terms of developing our teaching and developing our programs overall. That's me done.
I think that's Lisa.
Lisa, yeah.
Oh, hi everybody. My name's Lisa Zaranika. I'm practice tutor in the London region, and I've been with Frontline for 6 months now. I think, not just to cop out and move on quickly, but yeah, I would echo everybody's sentiments so far. I've also recently come from practice and have been in management and have given feedback as part of that. And I think, as Chris said, it's also about the capacity to receive feedback and being open to that. And that is something that I think is equally important in terms of practice and development and growth going forward. So yeah, I sit quite comfortably with the notion of feedback as well.
Right. Thanks, Lisa.
I think that's Laura.
Yeah.
Oh, hello.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to cop out. I think mine's very similar to everyone else, from being in practice, being in management, and now as a practice tutor in South Central, for anyone who doesn't know me. It's the same kind of relationship with feedback, and it's something that we do on a daily basis, and something that I rely on to make sure that my practice improves. So yeah, I'll keep it short. I think I'm quite comfortable with feedback.
Thanks, Laura. Can I ask, because I suspect it's the same for most practice tutors and those in similar roles working with participants and CSWs, whether there's any to change the question to those of you who feel like their answers have already been covered, to is there anything you struggled to give feedback about?
I can't remember who M is on the phone.
Hi, it's Mayuri.
Hi, Mayuri.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, I'm a practice tutor in the London region, and I've been around for about 4 months now. I was all ready with my response, and then you've changed the question. Thanks, Mary. I mean, so far in my role, I don't think there's been, I think I'm kind of used to having difficult conversations. I suppose the only additional thing is that I've recently started the postgraduate certificate in teaching, which has sort of helped me to think about feedback a little bit more and the way in which that feedback is presented. So I am sort of experimenting within feedback that I provide to participants in utilising some of that thinking. But generally, I don't think I have too much difficulty with the giving or receiving of feedback, so I don't really have that much to add in terms of challenges.
Okay, thank you.
Brittany.
Hi everyone, my name is Brittany Bernard. I'm one of the two practice development leads in the curriculum team. I was in
Brittany,
practice.
can I pause you? Sorry, we're getting a bit of feedback. Have you got your speakers? Can you turn your speakers down a bit?
Is that better?
Is that a dog?
No, it's good.
I wish it was a dog.
Go on, try again. We can hear you. You're just fainting a bit. Yes, distorted.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yes, okay.
I was saying that I'm quite practiced in giving feedback through my role as a social worker with my colleagues and with the people I worked with. But I think my experience of and I'm comfortable receiving feedback. I think depending on the team, it has sometimes felt safer or not as safe to give feedback upwards. And so that's something I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about, kind of how, so far in Frontline, something I've really liked is that it feels very like a very open place for feedback, all the different directions. I think sometimes that's not always the case. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about how Frontline creates that space.
Thank you. I think that links to a few people have already commented on the ability to receive feedback as well, doesn't it? So there needs to be a kind of an appetite and encouragement of that for different directions for it to feel comfortable. So we'll talk about that.
Definitely.
Who's HT?
Oh,
hi, Hannah.
I think that's Raf on the phone, but I could be wrong. So, Hannah?
Hi, so I'm Hannah. I'm a practice tutor in the Midlands. I think my relationship with feedback is okay. I think really echoing what Brittany said, I think coming from a local authority before Frontline, it's that resistance from senior managers to receive feedback, and actually how that maybe shapes my relationship with feedback in Frontline of how to pass that up the chain more than anything.
Thank you.
Is anyone else on the phone? I don't want to miss anyone.
Could those on the phone, I can hear someone, I thought it might have been you, Hannah, actually, mute. Could you just make sure you're on mute, if that's all right? Yeah, great, thank you.
So I'll kick off in the room for those that don't know me. I hope most people do. I'm Laura, I'm one of their HR officers at Frontline. I've been here 2 weeks on Friday. It's my 2-year anniversary. For everyone that 2 years. I've been here 2 years, not 2 weeks. And previous to Frontline, my experience with feedback was very, very different. It was something that you didn't give to people at all, unless you wanted to get fired. So it took quite a bit of an adjustment, but it's definitely a much better way, I've found, when people don't give you feedback directly to your manager instead of to you, which is what I had in the previous places. So that's kind of like where I've come from, where I'm at now.
I'm Lottie, I'm the recruitment coordinator. My experience with feedback is probably a bit different because this was my first role at university, so I didn't really have any experience before in it. But going into this role, I've definitely developed my feedback because we have to give the feedback back to the participants who have been successful on the assessment centres. So it's definitely something I've learned throughout doing that.
Yeah, I'm Alfie. I'm a recruitment officer in the recruitment team. In my previous role, I did have to give quite a lot of feedback. I was in a team leader position, so I had to give a lot of feedback to my team and receive it from them as well. So I became fairly comfortable in doing it in my previous role. And similar to Lottie, I have to give a lot of feedback to people who didn't pass the assessment centre, which can be tricky at times. So definitely been able to develop in that. I suppose internally, I haven't felt the need to give as much feedback as I did in my previous role, but I feel like definitely sort of taking that upwards to my manager, feel comfortable doing that, I would say.
I'm Shada, I'm also a recruitment officer, so it is quite similar to Alfie. Similarly, we have to give feedback to people who haven't been successful. Sometimes participants who have been successful, but there was like one area that we just felt that they needed feedback on, which can kind of, you have to be quite sensitive about as well. In my previous role, I was working with postgrad students, and there was kind of like a culture there where you shouldn't be giving as much feedback, so it's quite different here. And yeah, I feel quite comfortable giving feedback. In terms of saying internally, I haven't really felt the need to give it so often, but I'm communicating with my manager if so.
Hi, I'm Georgia. I'm the program coordinator for the program management team. The feedback is quite new to me. I've never really done it before. So much so that actually when I went for my interview and I'd read the freedom and responsibility paper, which mentions feedback directly, actually scared me a little bit. And it was something, this workshop was actually something that I asked would be provided or not. I think giving feedback for me is dependent upon who I'm giving it to. So if it's someone within my direct team, that's fine. But if it's somebody outside, I'm not too sure on how to approach that. And then again, the issue of how to receive feedback is something that I'd like to work on.
Great. Thank I'm Mary. I've been with Frontline coming up to 5 years, it might be just over 5 years actually, in a few different roles. And I think your point, Georgia, is really true. So I think I really like feedback, and I think that's why I like working at Frontline, because I really like that culture. And in different roles, particularly local authorities, that's sort of been quite dependent who I feed back to and how. So again, those comments have kind of been made as well. But I think the thing for me is around the relationship I have with people and how that enables me to give feedback. We've talked about safety as well. Brittany and Hannah have both talked about that too. So I think in Frontline, it's that focus on the relationship first that enables the feedback, which is what I really like and want us to think about today.
Hi, I'm Ravina. I've been with Frontline since January the 2nd. I'm the Academic Programmes Coordinator. So yeah, this is my first job out of uni, so I don't have a huge amount of giving feedback, but I'm very much someone who's able to absorb feedback in order to improve. But yeah, within what Georgia said, within the programmes team, there is a real strong culture of giving feedback within our team. But yeah.
Great. Maybe I'm the academic registrar. I'm quite comfortable giving feedback and receiving feedback, maybe because of my experience in universities are normally open to feedback. Yeah. And I'm more comfortable giving feedback to students or having different discussions with students rather than colleagues, but I feel it's okay.
I'm Sarah, I'm the Finance and Compliance Project Manager. I think I'm relatively comfortable receiving feedback and giving feedback to people that I know well and have a relationship with. I think I find it harder, particularly with constructive feedback, isn't it, for someone that I've only been working with a short time or don't really know very well.
I'm Josie. I'm the new head of program management, and it is my second day today. I feel really confident and comfortable with feedback. My last work it was a big part of our culture, and actually was a reason that I was so interested in working here. So that was really positive for me. I think the things that I think always need a bit of focus on are the real time feedback. So people are not sort of saving it up for appraisals later on, and making sure that we're giving it to people that are still doing really well as well. I think that can get forgotten, and they're kind of resting on a lot of roles for people that are high performers. And I guess for me, it'll be interesting. I was with my last place for quite a while, so I knew what sort of feedback I would always get because it was often the same. And so it'll be interesting if, in a new setting, it will be different and new, and be interested to see how I kind of feel and respond to that.
I'm Laura, I'm the Programme Officer in the Programme Management team, and I've been here for about 5 weeks. I'm fairly comfortable receiving and giving feedback to people that have been in sort of more supportive roles, people that have been supporting my work. And I've had a bit of experience giving feedback upwards, which has been quite mixed in the way it's been received. So it'd just be interesting how I can work on those things.
Hi, I'm Tessa Godfrey. I'm a principal practice tutor in the London team. And so I kind of concur with my fellow tutors that I suppose giving feedback is a really big part of what we do with CSWs and participants. And I suppose I try and model that kind of what we want them to do with families, as in a strengths-based approach, but also being really clear if we're worried about anything. So that's my aim. I'm kind of interested in, we also ask, I try and ask feedback a lot from participants, which is really helpful. We've also got systems for asking for feedback, electronically, and I don't think we've got that quite right yet, or how we respond to that. But obviously that's a wider issue, but that was just kind of going through my mind
It's a really good point.
when we were talking.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Henry. I'm an active principal practice tutor in the South Central region. Much like the other practice tutors, I've been a social worker, so part of my job title essentially giving feedback. It's interesting being here today because I had a very emotive conversation with a student yesterday who has some feedback from service users. Really badly. So I'll be interested what they get out of this conversation. She said she's got very low self-esteem. Any feedback is. She walked out of her skills and feedback. So I'll pick some up. This is really good.
Definitely.
Hi,
Kaplan. I'm Executive Assistant to Mary Jackson and Lisa Hackett. I'm really comfortable receiving feedback. I have no experience with feedback, but not for as Laura said in past jobs, I think that it was definitely not a part of being at work. So that's been a bit strange. But good. My past experience with feedback has been, I've spent like over 10 years in competitive sports and team leadership. And so it's like a very, very big thing, giving it and receiving it. And I'm very comfortable with it in that context. But in the workplace, it's very new. And I look forward to being here and learning more about that.
Thank you. Can I just ask again, someone's got their microphone on, sorry?
I think it's Azora's.
Azora, it's, so Laura, thanks. Hopefully it is. Could you mute Azora, just because we're getting a little bit of kind of bustling, it sounds like, in the background. I think I'm up next, aren't I, Laura? Yeah. Is that right? Okay, so I'm just going to go through really quickly what we will cover. I think it's been hugely, that's helpful and insightful for people at different levels, but also a bit of a steer around what people want to focus on, which is great. I guess what we didn't say from the outset, but I want to say now, is that obviously what you share, we want to be hearing your thoughts and views, but what you share, you'll need to use your judgment with. Obviously, you've got colleagues alongside you, so just be sensitive and think about what people, this goes without saying, but what people might feel and think about what you're saying. So first of all, what happens if we don't give feedback? And I think this links to your point, Henry, around your participant in a way that essentially feedback's an opportunity for learning. So if we don't give it, there will be things that we don't see that other people see, and we absolutely will miss the opportunity to fine tune how we work together if we don't have it. There's also, what we'll talk about is some different models for giving and getting feedback. And also, again, I think it was you, Josie, who said the importance of positive feedback. So we're going to spend as much time. That's certainly one of the tweaks that we've made across the time of doing this, is that sometimes we're too focused on the tricky elements, which are, it feels trickier to give challenging or kind of constructive feedback, yet there is just as much challenge in giving praise. So we want to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. And then finally, lots of people have said it in the kind of go around, but essentially being not just receiving it when it comes, actually actively seeking it out, making sure people know you're open to it. That's a really core part of the culture as well. And then I guess just a bit of a kind of around that you know, we someone referenced freedom and responsibility. It was you, Georgia, and that's absolutely core to our sort of our culture is feedback, and that's kind of talked about quite clearly in freedom and the freedom and responsibility paper. And also there's something about that sense of, again, us wanting to grow and develop as an organisation, and feedback is pretty cool to that. So that is, and then I guess that the only other thing, which I don't know whether we need to spend too much time on because we've got such a big group and worried about not getting through everything, but if you can all just quietly take a little minute to think about an example where you have either given or received feedback, either praise or something that you found challenging to hear or deliver, just to get us in the zone. If we just do that from the outset, that'd be great.
You won't be expected to share it.
No.
It's helpful to kind of bring some context to the slides if you've got an example in your head of when it's either gone well or not gone well. So I kind of wanted to get your thoughts from the room and on the phone about what is the cost if we avoid giving feedback for Frontline and for yourself. Any thoughts that immediately jump out to you?
You don't learn. You don't really learn exactly how to develop, because obviously you don't see it from an outsider's perspective, so you're not actually aware.
Yeah.
Maybe stagnation. You're sort of not thinking about changing the way you do things necessarily.
Yeah.
You might get really wound up by this person who's behaving this way, and I can't live away.
Any thoughts on the phone?
I think there is a danger that if you don't give feedback, particularly reasonably promptly, that the behaviour could continue and even escalate, and then that causes a bigger difficulty later on further down, and people will say, well, why didn't you tell me beforehand? You saw this before, why didn't you deal with it then?
You might have seen the next slide.
No, I haven't. I really haven't.
Yeah, so kind of all of those things. One of the things that is really important is if somebody, if you're not telling somebody something, they're probably aware, they can tell in the way that you're behaving that you're probably sitting on something and holding it, and that kind of will impact your relationship that you have with that person. So they won't know if something needs to change or improve, but also the individual can feel that they're not being noticed when things are going well, and so the same applies. And if you're holding back on that, the other person will probably be aware of it, which can kind of lead to this feeling of kind of like mediocrity, where, like you were saying, like you don't want to try anything new or do things differently because you've not been told either way whether something's going well or something's not going well. And then ultimately, when things get really bad, as you mentioned, I think it was Azora, I hope.
Yes, it was, yeah.
It can lead to grievances, and that's when the position that we don't want to be in, and kind of don't expect people to kind of get to that point where we've got to kind of a grievance situation where you've basically built up a narrative about somebody else based on the fact that you've not actually told them that that's the case and they haven't changed that behaviour. So there's the kind of like some of the, I guess, key risks of when we kind of hold on to things, whether it's positive or constructive. Any thoughts, anything that I've missed?
I guess one thing I would say, and we touched on this as well, is that what we hear a lot is when people get feedback is that, particularly from a manager to their team, is that it shows that people have noticed. There's been an appreciation, there's been an awareness and a noticing of someone's behaviour, which again is the risk of, if you're not sort of feeding back, people feel like what they're doing isn't good.
Yeah. So this is, we talked a little bit at the beginning, one of the models of giving feedback. And this is, I really like this one because I think from doing this a couple of times, this is the one that people seem to resonate with quite a lot. You can see yourself, how you can end up kind of falling down this kind of line of appreciation. So where we kind of want everyone to be is in a bit of a loop between expectation. We don't want everyone to be, but the way you can get back from going down into the red is through giving feedback. This model is actually from couples therapy. So the top level is actually attraction, but then we've taken that out, obviously. It starts with attraction, moves on to appreciation. And that's kind of, say you're working with someone new in your team, whether it's a colleague, a manager, or someone that you're managing, and you start to notice things that you really appreciate about that person, whether it's them doing a really great piece of work, or they're always on time, or for meetings, really like keen. And that's kind of how you build up familiarity, and that's kind of where expectations start to get set, is kind of what you would expect of that person based on what you've appreciated about them. And then something happens, it goes wrong, a deadline gets missed, they've started to kind of not perform as well, or behave in a certain way which you really don't appreciate. That's where we kind of end up moving down into disappointments, and that is fine, provided that we're giving feedback so that we can get back up to what your expectations are. And if your expectations aren't clear, it's quite easy to fall from expectations down to disappointments. And then what happens is the appreciation down to expectations can be quite a slow thing. You could appreciate someone or have familiarity and expectations for a good year. But what we find is when people move from disappointed down this scale, that can be quite a rapid movement in terms of, using the example of missing a deadline, you've moved from disappointed and it happens again, and then you're kind of in this grievance area where you've kind of decided that that person always misses deadlines, and instead of telling them you've missed this deadline or you've not done what I've asked you to when I asked you to, you've basically like made a threshold for that person that when they start doing things that you appreciate or want them to do, or they do it on time, you're not really noticing because you've decided that that person is kind of behaving in that way. And then you kind of get yourself fixated in this, like building up this narrative of being right and proving that that person is what you've decided they are, because you've not kind of helped them get back up to where your expectations are, and then back up to familiarity and appreciation. And all it really could have taken is a conversation between kind of where your expectations are and where they are at the moment. And I think what is good about this model is it's quite easy to kind of think about a scenario that you might have been in or you've had a conversation where you can see it quite easily slipping from expectations down to disappointments. And the further down you get, the harder it is to get back up. Whereas somebody disappointing you and things not going right, it's bound to happen. Like, nobody's perfect. You can't expect that everyone's going to get everything right or behave in a way that you want them to all the time. But it's quite easy then to move back up. But once you've got down to this kind of point of being right, this is when it's quite difficult because you've not told them and then they're not really sure what it is that needs to happen to move all the way back up. Can you think of a time that if like you kind of felt that you can see this like happening in your work or you're even kind of outside of work where it kind of that resonates? I've got some nods in the room. I'm assuming you're nodding on the phone.
I guess the other thing to think about is that knowing that familiarity, expectation, disappointment loop, that often it's the toughest. So you might share your disappointment, but that might come around. So there can be a sense of giving up if you've named something a couple of times and not got anywhere, and again that can drop you down. So there's something about almost those things that are the toughest, and the things that need revisiting are the very things that need to keep being named, because it can so quickly become frustrating if you feel like someone's not hearing it. There's clearly a reason why that's the case.
I think the other thing to hear is this. It sounds like it's focusing very much on the developmental side of feedback, but it's also kind of ensuring that you're offering the right praise at the right time so that they don't fall into disappointments because they don't think that you've noticed when they're doing something really great. So in the same sense that you maintaining those expectations could be down to like a really specific piece of praise that you've given them so that they know what's gone well to do it again. So it works in both ways. Obviously, when you're further down, it's quite difficult to then praise them once you've built up this narrative about this person.
I think also there is an element that you have to have a shared understanding of what those expectations are. Because if you don't start from the premise of having that shared understanding, you're going to quickly spiral down into the final 4 sections. And that shared understanding will give familiarity, and therefore appreciation and acknowledgement can be more readily given, I think.
Yeah.
And it's feedback that gets to that shared understanding, or at least and kind of two-way discussion around what that looks like. I completely agree.
That's one of
one model
I like. I think it's a nice easy one.
The next one might be vaguely familiar to some people, but this is the radical candor model. And I guess for those people who are familiar with transactional analysis, there are some similarities in terms of the quadrants. Don't worry if you're not, it's one to look up if you're interested in, but I think this one captures a lot of the similar themes. And I think in social work, the description is sort of having challenging conversations. That's the translation from radical candor. But there's lots of models that have the same kind of general principles. And essentially what we've got is the four quadrants, and the first being is ruinous empathy. Oh, no, it's not. And I guess what Kim Scott in the book Radical Candor uses the example of, let's imagine a colleague has got a piece of spinach in their teeth. Just a really simple example, and we'll go through each of the quadrants and explain what the response is to that. So first of all, the manipulative insincerity quadrant is if you've seen someone have spinach in their teeth, but you don't want to make them feel uncomfortable by telling them, so you just shy away from it, knowing that they're going to walk around for 3 hours with spinach in their teeth. So it might be that you're worried about how it might make you look when you tell them. It might be that you're worried about how they'll feel, but essentially it's looking at the immediate rather than the bigger picture. The next one is like a surprise. Yes, good. I've not aggressive. And it's I think that so if you wanted to rate these, you could, but essentially the benefit of there's nothing great about being obnoxious nor being aggressive, but the only advantage is they know they've got spinach in their teeth. So you still achieved something, though you might not have done it in the best way, and it's not what we're aiming for. But at least they've got some information from you that they might be able to use, even though they could use it better if it was done in a better way. I'm guessing the next one will be
Surprise.
Thank you. So this is where you're really. This is one that is particularly common, I think, at Frontline, but essentially because we encourage a culture where we care for each other. So it's where you worry about hurting someone's feelings, and you worry about holding something back on the basis that it will make them feel worse if they know, in this case, the spinach. But the point with ruinous empathy is that the upshot is to get the spinach out of their teeth. Or with a colleague, it might be that they need to know a piece of information that might be hard to hear, but that will help them do their work better. So that's a not helpful place to be at all. And then the final point is obviously radical candour, and that's what you do. You take them aside and you mention it to them quietly. Now, the main thing and the kind of underpinning of this entire model is that underneath giving anyone any feedback is the relationship, and them believing that you are doing it with their best intent in mind, their best outcome in mind. And that is, so it's a combination of really caring for someone and genuinely being interested in their well-being, and being really, really frank. And we know again from social work that it's a concept of relational risk. Sometimes it is better to be frank with someone, and that builds trust, than it is to shy away for the other sort of three reasons. Now, we've also touched that there is no way you're ever going to stick entirely in radical candour all the time. People will move around the four quadrants, and that you'll learn to step back and work out. And there's also a bit of a different, and depending on who you're talking to, a different way of putting something across. I know some of my team are way more open to things being spoken really frankly, and I have to know who they are and what they need before I'll kind of determine how to pitch something. And you'll all do the same with colleagues and with your teams as well. So that's the I guess the radical candour model. Now there is a book and there's lots of information around. We're going to watch a clip in a little bit, but I guess I wanted to give an exercise now. So if people were to say to me, well, let's imagine I go into a meeting and I start talking as fast as I am now again, and I've already been told by my team that I do that quite a lot. How would you feed that back to me? What would that look like? Feedback to tell me to slow down.
Depending on which box you choose.
Exactly. Let's go for manipulative insincerity first. I can take it.
I just wouldn't tell you.
Very good. Obnoxious aggression.
Slow down, Mary.
Thank you, Tessa. What about ruinous empathy?
Mary wouldn't want us to have.
Nice. Good. What about the other is obvious, but let's imagine it's in a meeting setting where we are now. How could you do it in a way that wasn't pulling me aside, but was making sure I knew what was going on?
Might just ask them to. Oh, sorry. Because I might just ask you to repeat it again, just because I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah. Great. Any from the phone? Did that all sound like what you were thinking as well?
Yeah, makes sense.
Can you hear us all on the phone in the room?
Yeah,
most of the time.
Perfectly.
Most of the time.
It might be
so we're going to move on to a clip, and this kind of really touches on one of the points that you mentioned earlier around some of the risks. I'm hoping that it's going to work. We had a few difficulties this morning, so just bear with me one moment.
So while you suss it out, Laura, so Kim, there's a lot of the Radical Candour book available in digestible sort of chunks, both via podcasts and via clips. We're going to show you a clip from a talk that Kim gave, which has some useful bits in it. And that's the only other thing I guess I meant to say earlier, is what I'd like to think we do in Frontline is enable feedback to happen in all sorts of different ways. So I think I know, by email, by face-to-face, by all the different mechanisms, skip level meetings that we try and encourage. And again, I guess I think try and keep all of those different ways in your heads today, because I think some situations might call for one type of response and others might call for a different one.
So I'm going to press play on the phone. Can you just let me know if you can hear it once I press play?
Will do.
And can you see it?
No.
No.
Interesting.
You need to.
Can you see yourselves now?
Yes.
Oh, saw
Really
something.
the most painful moment in my career. I just hired this guy, Bob. I really liked
Yeah, we can see it.
Right, thank you. Can you hear her talking about Bob?
Yeah, I can hear it and see it.
Yeah. So, to give some context, this is an example of where, and I think this one's quite key, around when you fall into ruinous empathy and the impact that can have on not only yourself, your team, but like also the individual and the organisation, and kind of what happens when you rely too heavily on ruinous empathy.
To explain what I mean by ruinous empathy, I'm going to describe probably the most painful moment in my career. I had just hired this guy, Bob. I really liked Bob a lot. He was funny, he was quirky. We were having one of those management offsites and playing a ridiculous management get-to-know-you game that nobody dared say this is a waste of time. Bob finally said, why don't we just go around the table and confess what candy our parents used when potty training us. Weird, but fast. Then, weirder yet, we all remembered Hershey's Kisses. And for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So he endeared himself to all of us. There was just one problem with Bob. His work was terrible, absolutely terrible. I learned later the problem was he was smoking pot in the bathroom, which maybe explained all that candy. But anyway, I didn't know it at the time. I kept trying to buck Bob up with false praise and say, Bob, you are so smart. This is not quite there yet, but I know you can do it. And he had no idea how bad things were until 10 months later, it became clear to me that if I did not fire Bob, I was going to lose half my team. And when I sat down and told Bob, explained Bob the situation, when I finished, he pushed his chair back from the table. He looked right at me and he said, why didn't you tell me? And as that question is going around in my head with no very good answer, he said, why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me. And I realized I'm having to fire Bob now because of mistakes that I made. 6 really important mistakes. I didn't ask him to tell, and I never.
So what are your initial thoughts on that clip? It's quite, I guess, an extreme point, but
Why would she need to still fire him? Why can't she rectify it? Is it too late?
I'm guessing, yeah.
Yeah.
By that point.
Well, 10 months in, and I think that in the book she talks about having had to rewrite reports and give them. I mean, she's owning that it was her not having managed it well, but the damage, that he wasn't the right person for that job, and that if she'd flagged it earlier and told him earlier, then maybe he could have found a job that he was the right person for. But she'd been covering for him and writing the reports for the last 10 months, and as she said, the team were noticing this and feeling like she was favouring him, and that they were having to cover the work that he wasn't doing. That's the context. Probably not.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
You see, sometimes maybe this is shifting the focus of it, but see it in local authorities sometimes. And I've got one local authority where I work with where, all the members of the team are leaving and the manager is still there. And it's like, why don't you deal with that manager? Because that is clearly the issue, and you see that so many times. And whether that's about local authorities being, it is very, very difficult to get rid of someone in a local authority. You have to do something incredibly bad. I think you could get away with smoking dope in the toilets. I think you could. I think you can.
But that's interesting thing, Tessa, isn't it? Because if that so what we don't know in that scenario you've just given an example of is whether the manager has any understanding of feedback. Those team members, whether that loop is there.
Exactly.
And if they were, whether that would, I think in some cases it's very difficult when people are being given very frank feedback to ignore that stuff. So I think it's probably a system as much as it is the individuals within the system, isn't it?
And it's something that we encourage, particularly with in the first year and second year, but people going into the second year, and encourage them to have those conversations with their managers if it's not quite working for them. And I have had that conversation with several people transitioning into year 2 where that kind of relationship with their manager isn't quite what they want it to be.
And it's really tough.
Yeah.
It's really tough in a system where feedback's not the norm for people newly qualified coming in. And,
I think from my perspective, in HR, this kind of scenario is the last place that I want to be. Somewhere I've worked previously is managers have come to me like, this person's useless, they need to go, and I'll be like, have you told them? And the conversation goes, not in so many words, but they know, like they're not doing what they need to be doing. They're missing deadlines, and in actual fact, the person has no idea that they're not doing good work. And because people can't be bothered to have those conversations or don't feel comfortable having those conversations, or you've built this culture where it's not okay to have those kind of conversations, people then are in a situation where they've got people not in the right jobs, and it's got to a point where they've built up this narrative that we talked about earlier, which is just not where we want to be. And I was surprised how often people are kind of like, how do we get rid of them? Because they're not doing what they need to be doing. But at no point during their employment had they actually told them. And then you find yourself in a very difficult situation as HR where you're like, well, what do you want to do about this? So that's kind of like in this scenario, how it'd been 10 months, nobody in the team had told them. Because while it's definitely the line manager's responsibility to be holding that and they are accountable, if the team were also noticing it, I would question why no one else in the team, and he'd said, no one told me, like why that hasn't come from somewhere across the organisation, which is where I think the culture is very different here, in the sense that I would expect that people across teams would be able to have that conversation as well as where I've worked in previous places, which will name unknown.
And I think the point Kim's illustrating is the realness empathy point, the idea of kind of not wanting to hurt someone's feelings and that getting in the way of the message being delivered well. And I guess I think again the risks at Frontline are there because we genuinely have a culture where we care about each other and there's a loyalty between us. So I think for me the difference is that the radical candor bit is about the caring gives us the opportunity to speak in a way that it can be heard in a sensitive way, so that the message is still delivered. And so we're on a really good foundation that a lot of organisations, local authorities, and
interestingly, she said that when he pushed his chair back, he said, "I thought you guys cared about me," and so it's absolutely doing the opposite of what they think they're doing.
Exactly,
which is a real shame.
I think there's also something with the sort of examples we've just had around the realness empathy. Okay, you're not wanting to upset that person, but by perhaps sometimes not addressing that issue, it can cause harm or upset to other people as well.
It's less direct. You're not
I suppose it also takes away the opportunity for growth, because actually that's a wasted 10 months for him in which he could have supported him to scaffold and help him to develop. But in doing the work for him and not showing him where he was going wrong and giving him perhaps a support plan, she took away that opportunity for him to develop. So I suppose in caring, we should also be helping those people who need developing to develop.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually one of the things I like most about the books and Kim is how frank she is about when she's got it wrong, because it actually is really, it's not common to hear when people have really made, such, and she clearly, as she says at the start, this is something that really sticks with her and was one of the worst kind of points of her career, which is, you can imagine, it feels horrible.
And that we're going to move on to Grace.
No, that's all right. You can take it away if you want to, Laura.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so lots of tips around praise, and I think one of the nicest things about Frontline is that kind of commitment to knowing when we could do things better, which I wouldn't want to remove. But I think it's really human nature to focus on the things we could do better. But there is so much good stuff happening all the time that goes unspoken about. I don't think it goes unnoticed, but I think we're much clearer on giving feedback when we think it's constructive than we do when we think something's great. So we wanted to talk through a few kind of tips for that. So the first thing, I guess, is the idea around how much time you prepare for, spend preparing for praising someone, and how much thought you put into it, and I guess that, so in some cases, again, in the podcast, there's a suggestion of a ratio, which we've really steered away from because we don't think there's any sort of perfect ratio. But the idea is definitely you want to legitimately and genuinely praise more than you give constructive, because again, the nature of that feedback relationship is the relationship. So if you're telling someone what you appreciate about them as much as what you think they could improve upon, you're much more likely to kind of strike a chord. So the thinking about the praise is the really important thing to do. So thinking about what they do well, how you can prepare them for the fact that you can, and possibly even practicing that as well. The second point, and this is one that I've been this is the bit that Radical Candor has really increased my awareness of, is making sure you're really clear why you're pleased with someone and why they're doing a good job. So I think historically I would write emails to people saying that was, really nice email, or, great work, without being specific about why. So now I always try and say, it was a really nice email, it was super clear, and there would be no doubt in that person's mind what you were meaning, it had a really nice tone. Be quite specific so that the person can kind of replicate whatever they did again. And then the other thing is that notion around, again, the sort of idea that you have to say something nice to say something constructive. That's not true at all. But the main thing we would say is that you have to mean the feedback. It can't be just a platitude. It's got to be genuine. You've got to see something that you really like. And I think that what we've seen lately a lot on Teams is that that's happening more and more. People across teams, across the organisation will see something that looks a great piece of work from a colleague and say, this is really great, and sort of flag why. And I think that's a really great example of how, because the notion of, again, up and down feedback is not the only way it needs to go. It needs to go all the way around. And I think we're really all committed to that here.
Yeah, I think that second one, I've done this workshop a couple of times with Sam, and over the period of time, one of the things that I always ask for feedback on is my presenting in front of people. And it's got to a point where I've been doing this a couple of times with Sam, and Sam has given me really specific feedback about what went well in the last time we did this for me to build on it. And it's not so much like, oh, you seemed really confident, because that's actually not really that specific. It was kind of, I noticed that you had prepared this example for this bit, and that came across, and you presented it really well and clear. And I think it's just the nuance between saying something that went well and actually kind of being really specific about what you noticed and then the impact that had. And that has made a really big difference for me. Thinking about how you would present that information in the same way. When you're thinking about having a difficult conversation with somebody, I write down my thoughts on a piece of paper, but I would never do that when I'm trying to think about when I'm giving someone a compliment or something that has gone well. And what we kind of want is for you to be thinking as much as you are when you're going to have that kind of challenging conversation. When you're giving praise, it should be equally, if not more, meaningful, because you're going to appreciate that a lot more and have it in equal measure in terms of how much you want to prepare for that.
And we know from sort of our teaching and our programs that the more specific and certainly sort of in terms of role playing and practicing those kind of notions stick much better if you're looking at specific. So that's why it sticks. But I'm also interested in the sense that I think when I get feedback that is really specific, it sticks with me in a way that it doesn't if it's not. And that's why the learning is, and I'm wondering if anyone can think of examples where they've had feedback which has kind of been a little bit of a light bulb moment of that you're doing this particular thing well because the feedback, this praise has been so specific.
Anyone in the room on the phone?
Yeah, exactly.
you can come at?
I can think of one for me. That I was at a board meeting a couple of board meetings ago, and Josh told me afterwards that I'd sort of been clearer in the second one than I'd been in the first one, and it was because I'd prepped in advance, and he didn't know that I'd prepped in advance. But his feedback was how I presented in the meeting. So again, it was a really good clue for me that what I was doing was working in some way. So. Anyone? I do want to hear from others. What of us talking?
I think for me, feedback's been most helpful when it's something that I'm really not aware of, and that is when you have that light bulb moment, is that, you've kind of got stuck in a certain pattern of something. So I'm just thinking of an example of when I was doing my master's and sending work to my supervisor, which was about how I was managing my team. And she was able to spot things that I was doing, which was basically having too optimistic a view, which is which is often my tendency, but she was able to highlight that for me, and it was very, it was a real kind of, it took a few days to really sink in, but it's like, oh my God, yeah. And then thinking about where that came from. So for me, it's where people are able to show me something that I'm not aware of aware of myself. That is so powerful, and kind of and then that helps, because it doesn't take away that tendency, but it brings it to the surface where it's otherwise kind of subconscious, if you like.
Great. Any thoughts from the phones?
I can think of one from last week where when we had our Masters Day. Because it was one of my first sessions on the Masters teaching, I had asked for some feedback from colleagues, and it was really helpful to have some specific feedback from one of the practice tutors who talked about my style and my approach to that session and the timing of the session. So it came after lunch when people were a bit flatter, and the bit of feedback that she gave me really helped me to think about why I was delivering it in the way that I was. So I found myself managing my own kind of anxiety through having quite a kind of slow tone and pace. But given the timing of that session, it might have been one that might have been more helpful to be a bit more energized. So it just helped me to think about what I was doing, why I was doing it, what the purpose it served for me, but then also think about what I needed to do to kind of engage the participants. So it really was a helpful, reflective moment getting that feedback from my colleague.
Great, it's a great example. Thank you. I'm going to give one more. I'm sorry, Laura. I know I can see you're trying to move me on. But one more example of a member of my team who she and I went to a meeting at the Department for Education, and I've been in heaps more of those meetings, so she was absolutely deferring to me, but she's a proper expert in the area that I'm not. And so afterwards, there was a real sense of her not being clear on what she contributed. So me sort of having to say and saying really clearly, these are the bits that you really nailed and I wouldn't have. And she'd said that next time again, she would make sure she spoke more along those lines, and it would kind of clearly steer her into that area of work. So all right, you can move me on.
So this is another, this is what we call kind of like a stabilizer, hence the in terms of how you might want to structure your feedback if you're not that familiar with doing it. So I know Georgia was saying outside, when you have the relationship, it's a lot easier to give that feedback when you're giving it outside your teams, for example, or with people that you might not have that relationship with just yet. These IBIC is a good way of kind of thinking about how you might want to structure that. Start by giving the intent, and I think that is what will really help, particularly if the relationship isn't as strong or you're not that comfortable with it as yet. Say what is the reason that you're giving them the feedback? It's not necessarily for your benefit, it might be, but ideally it's for theirs. What you've noticed in terms of the behaviours, don't rely on, oh, so-and-so told me that you've done this. It has to be kind of what you've seen and what you've noticed. The impact that has then had on you, on the organisation, on the team, and then kind of I think this bit's particularly important, and because it's often a point that can sometimes be missed, is you get so kind of caught up in the idea of I want to get my feedback across, is not being curious as to what might have caused that behaviour or that problem or what's going on. And I think once you've explained what it is, kind of be curious as to why, what is the why has that happened with that person, so that it's not just you kind of being like, here's some information, I want you to take it in and go away. And then a commitment around kind of like what you would hope would be different in that scenario. It just breaks it down into kind of a few little steps that we find that if you're not that comfortable with it, or even if you wanted to think about it before you were going to have that conversation, this might be a good way to structure it. It's not to say that when you have that conversation that it's going to follow that, because obviously you're having a conversation with another person, but I think it's particularly if it's new to you when having conversations with people, it's quite an easy structure to follow and thinking about how it will come out.
And the curiosity example is a great one in terms of the example we just heard around the at the was it Masters Recall Day, I think, the example from the phone. I'm sorry, I don't know who was speaking then. Maori. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, that was mine.
Brilliant. So what I guess I was saying is you being curious about your pace, you understanding why you were talking at a certain pace. That's a really key part to knowing, and how you can shift to giving more energy next time. It's awareness, and the curiosity around that feels really important.
So the behaviours thing is a good reminder of why it's so much better to give the feedback yourself. I often get people escalating to me about my team, and it just makes things so much harder to give feedback, because I'm just not going to be as effective if I'm saying somebody else's examples. And so it's kind of remembering when it feels uncomfortable to give feedback to a peer, that actually there's a reason why it's better to do it that way, because you need the better examples.
Yeah, great.
So I think this is one that comes in front one.
All right.
Our top 6 of tips of giving feedback at Frontline. Mary, you're going to start.
Number 1. The first thing to say is it can be really hard, but back to the point lots of other people have made, is that we ask social workers to do this with families. We ask our participants who are training to be social workers to do this with families. We expect practice tutors to do it with CSWs. It's core to everything we do. So we have to kind of internally as an organisation live by that as well, and hold ourselves to the same standard, which I guess we're all clearly here, so we know that. And I guess the back to that relationship with families is the fear of saying something that might be perceived as critical can be quite strong. So kind of really trying to not lean into that too much and resist that fear, because that's how we get ruinous empathy and back to that. It's also it's got to be genuine, and it's got to be fair. So some of the tips around all of that knowledge, trying it out as a way of testing some of those ideas. I know lots of people. I've done kind of role playing sounds so terrifying, but have just run through a conversation a few times with different people. I've done it with Anoshi. I'm sure she wouldn't mind me sharing on several occasions when she's known she's got a particular tricky conversation coming up with usually someone not in-house, but I think she's done it with colleagues as well in some instances. But she manages people, our coaching network, our leadership development advisors, who are all working out in wildly different systems from ours, and has had to have some really challenging conversations. And often we'll do it 3 or 4 times, because I will sort of say, well, I don't know whether you've thought about how that would be perceived, and we'll just go back and forth. So and that goes with the praise as well, back to Laura's point around trying to think about things, how will things be perceived in a positive way as well, because you want people to remember what the conversation after the event. So first of all, have a go at trying it out. It really does help. We know again from our teaching on the Frontline program and the First Line program that that idea of practice perfect, the more times you've done something, the more naturally you'll default to it in the moment if you've tried doing it in a different way. So we know practice works, so don't be too shy about trying it out. Thank gosh, that was seamless, Laura. Thank you. Think really hard about the language you're using. And back to the example around that person's always late, or they always get things in, that's not helpful in any way. And back to curiosity, there will always be a reason why it's difficult. And Bob, why Bob was smoking up in the toilets? Was his manager, peeving him off so much that he wasn't? So trying to think about all the reasons around and avoiding labeling a person or a behaviour, person with a behaviour, because that way you're just going to get to the very bottom of that kind of list of arrows. I can't remember what the model's called, sorry. But you're going to get stuck in the problem or situation within that individual as opposed to the system within which they work and all the ways that might be impacting on their behaviour. So a really, really core part of that is listening to their views. So any feedback needs to be a two-way process. It's not one person is delivering feedback to the other. There needs to be a curiosity and a kind of dialogue. Number 3.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. You got to relate because you were so on. And then we've touched on this a little bit as well, a lot, in fact. But the idea of once you've got that foundation of a relationship, then it makes it so much easier to get it to be honest and open. And I think that basis of a relationship can sometimes. So the idea of not shying away from giving difficult feedback if you don't feel you have that foundation, because we know again from in social work with families, naming something from the outset might increase the sense of trust. So if you're being frank with someone, you're saying something that feels risky and that you're putting yourself a little bit on the line, then they will see that and understand that it means that you care or are concerned about them, and that can in fact create a sense of trust. The only other thing, I guess, back to the idea of Frontline wanting to think about different ways to get and receive feedback, to deliver and receive feedback, is the idea of different mechanisms for doing it. And I guess the one of the things that I think is hugely valuable, and I don't know whether we do enough, is, and someone's touched on it here, is the asking in advance for feedback. So whether that be a specific scenario, I kicked myself because I went to an induction event and I'd meant to email the team, the South Central team, and ask in advance to watch me present and give me feedback, and I forgot. So I emailed Vicky afterwards and said, I forgot, but can you tell me anything? And she hasn't come back. So I think it's much easier if you're watching for stuff in advance and you know what you're looking for and what the person wants feedback in. And the other great example I've had of that is Mehmet, who's just left us, but I try and do feedback every 3 months to 3 people I don't work with that closely across the organisation or that aren't in my team. And it's just a general, what do you think? And I got the most amazing written feedback back from Mehmet, which literally, I would never have seen things from the perspective with which he looked at them just because of where he was. So he talked a lot mostly about how my lens was sometimes on my area, and he thought there could be real value if I was more cross-organisational. But it was his kind of perspective was so great and so different from mine that it was hugely valuable. So, and that wasn't in the moment. That was really considered. There was no time pressure. It took him about a month, I think, but he really thought about it. So just trying to think about all the different ways that you can garner and encourage feedback.
So this is one that I think gets talked about quite a lot with feedback, is around this point about being timely. And I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because it's much more valuable if you give the feedback in the moment at the time when you're, whether that's praise or developmental feedback. That said, don't let time be a reason not to give it. It will be more valuable if you do it within a reasonable time frame. But if there is something that has bothered you or that you thought was really great and it's been 2 weeks, 2 months, whatever, the chances are that person probably needed to hear it, and there's no reason why you shouldn't give that feedback, even if it isn't in the moment. And I think you have to take into consideration that sometimes it's actually not that practical to give them the feedback straight away. You might want to do it face to face instead of over the phone. But don't let the fact that you didn't do it straight away be a deterrent for not actually giving the feedback, because that's actually equally unvaluable. And you could find yourself in a situation a bit like Bob, where 10 months have passed, where I was definitely meant to say it, and it kind of doesn't come out. And I had a conversation with Sam about something where it was really bothering me, and Sam was like, "Did you tell them?" And I was like, "No, but I'll do it when I'm, next there." And it literally took me about 3 months, and I went back up, and it kind of felt really out of context, but it really made a really big difference in terms of, because I hadn't been in the office that I wanted to give the feedback, I kind of sat on it for 3 months, and it felt more uncomfortable for me and probably for the person that was having it. So
And I've got an example from the flip side where I said something and didn't know how it had landed, and it was 3 months later the head of region told me that they'd taken it, it had really, affected them. They thought it was really unfair and they raised it with me over a coffee. And so I would absolutely still want to get that feedback. I'd have had no idea otherwise unless they'd flagged it.
Clarity. Got my word. Be precise. Unnecessary terms. As you would expect, it's really difficult to give feedback if you're not being clear. And I think one of the things that we try to kind of really encourage at Frontline is, if you're giving that piece of feedback, whether again it's developmental or in terms of praise, it's okay to come back to it and check that that person has fully understood that that's what the point that you're trying to make. Particularly with developmental, I think it's important to be able to come back to it and kind of ensure that they are aware that that's kind of the point you were making, why you were saying it, kind of going back to that model of kind of the commitment that you made at the end. Was it 100% clear? When it's a really challenging piece of feedback and it can be hard to hear, they might not be listening to what else is coming in terms of, why it's important, what the impact that had on you. And it's okay to take a break and come back to that and just ensure that there is complete clarity in terms of how they've interpreted it and also how you said it. I think particularly for me, I have to write down what I want to say before I say it, so that I at least know that I've made the points that I'd planned to, because when I come to having that conversation, it might be a bit more challenging. That said, that's what I think I say in my head and what comes out my mouth aren't always the same thing. So kind of coming back to that and ensuring that they understand the point that you're making. And this last point, I think this is particularly pertinent if you're having a conversation with somebody and you're telling them about a conversation you've had with somebody else, and you're kind of there like, oh, and then I said this, and I said this, and they said this, and the other person's actually like, I'm not sure that's actually the full scope of what's happened. Is you kind of prepared so much that you kind of want to just get everything out, but actually you've not said everything that you intended to say because you prepared so much, and then somebody else has kind of come back with a response that you weren't expecting because you've written the script for them, and then you find yourself in a situation where you've kind of prepared so much that you're not actually getting the point across, so that because of the way they've responded. And kind of bearing in mind that you're having a conversation with another person, and if it's hard to hear, like kind of being open to it could be an emotional response, and then you might not kind of get to anywhere near down the bottom of the scale of where you wanted to kind of that feedback to go. Are there any of those that kind of really stand out to you, or kind of think I've been in a scenario where that's gone really well or not so well?
I think timeliness. I think like Josie was saying, like sometimes when you say something straight away to someone, maybe it seems like less heavy as well. I know something that I know from like my sports background is that a system that we have in like the London team that I play for is that we have like a differentiation between like observation and feedback. And feedback is the kind of thing where you take someone aside and you tell them that they have a pattern of doing X and they need to do Y. And an observation is where you're very clear that you've seen them do it this one time now, and you use the present tense, like just now, I just saw you do this. And that's okay to give in the moment. And we're also told that that's like a less heavy thing to receive as well, and it feels less heavy, because then I can think, I know that I've just done that now, and they're not commenting about me in general. And that's just like one thing, and I don't necessarily need to know. And I think when I saw your slide about praise as well, it made me think, actually, that's true of that as well. Like, I can say, I just saw you do this thing really well. And sometimes I think if you have enough like one-time observations, you can sometimes avoid the heavy conversation where you say you always or you usually.
I think for me, clarity. I think going through these slides, I can definitely think of examples in my previous role where I was probably erring slightly towards ruinous empathy, but then thought, actually, I do need to give this feedback. But because I felt a bit awkward about giving it, wasn't quite clear enough in the way that I presented it, and then it didn't have any sort of effect. So then I felt like I'd given the feedback, but the person didn't take it on board. But that was probably because I wasn't clear enough about exactly what it was or why they might have been doing that.
I think one that stands like a piece of feedback that's always stuck with me around don't personalise, and I think this is one where and we'll kind of come on to how you respond to feedback in the next slide, but don't personalise is the one where you can kind of be in quite like tricky territory if you say something that isn't what actually you mean. And I was told once that I'm really loud. They were like, "Are you aware you're really loud?" And I was like, no, I've not been told that in my 27 years of life. What they actually meant was sometimes you're the only voice in the room, and that is what they were trying to get to, is it's okay for other people to be able to contribute and for you to be uncomfortable with silence. But what came out was, do you know you're really loud? And that's kind of like, that's something that's personal about me, I am, but what was actually intended was something that was actually a lot more helpful and kind of something that I can do something with, whereas you're really loud isn't actually what they meant, and B, that really helpful for me to learn from. And just kind of like it kind of comes down to being specific around you're always late versus I've noticed that you've missed a couple of deadlines, what's going on? And you're always late is quite a personal thing to say, whereas you've missed this deadline, what's going on is very specific and something they can do something about.
Any other thoughts?
I feel, actually, it's Azura here, I just feel that sometimes we perhaps don't give due care and attention to maybe some of the personal circumstances in which people might be wanting to either receive or have feedback, whether that's on a constructive area I'm thinking of more. And also we perhaps need to be mindful of differences of the social graces that people might be coming from. I know that I tend to be much more attentive to the age of the person or their gender or their race, or whether they have a disability that I might know of, so that I'm actually making sure that my feedback is as constructive as it can be in order to help understand what might be going on for them, so that it improves that relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, perfect
sense. It's like comes back to the relationships and kind of the context of when and how we're going to give that feedback, and it kind of links in with how you receive it as well. Is this my slide?
It is.
Okay. So giving feedback is great, but also there is something around how you receive feedback, and being open to getting feedback. And I think this is something that obviously we actively encourage at Frontline, is kind of not, it's all well and good giving feedback, but if you're not open to getting it, then you're kind of putting yourself in quite a difficult position. And when you're receiving feedback, things to avoid are kind of these justifying, explaining, or denial situations. I did the workshop before last, and some feedback we got about the feedback workshop was, this kind of sounds like you have to be really passive, and somebody gives you feedback and you just kind of have to be like, oh, okay, thanks, and like can't kind of explain yourself. That's not what I mean at all with this slide. It's more giving feedback is a real art, and it's really difficult, and you kind of, as the person being receiving it, let the other person giving their feedback kind of make the point that they want to make and kind of get it across. As the individual giving the feedback, that you'd hope there'd be an opportunity to be curious and understand where that's coming from, at which point then you can kind of be like, well, this is what's going on. But I think sometimes what can happen is you're like, oh, I've noticed this, and the instant response before it's even you've had the chance to say, what but like the impact that's had, the behaviours that you noticed, why you want it to change, you're in a kind of what feels like a bit more of a heated discussion about, well, you know, everything was happening at once, I had lots going on, 4 deadlines, and you're really a bit of a difficult conversation, which is kind of quite hard to navigate. If you're in a situation of denial, then that's quite a difficult conversation to have in terms of that never happened, that wasn't me. But at the same time, taking a break from the conversation can often be quite helpful, in the sense that, like you were saying, sometimes you might not be aware of that behaviour, or that was even something that had been noticed. And it might just take a little bit of time of you taking that feedback in, reflecting on it, and coming back to it later. So while at the moment you might be I don't know where that's come from, that seems pretty outrageous, but coming back to it, maybe kind of having a different lens on it. And then yeah.
And I guess I would, to continue that sort of idea around responding when someone gives you feedback, I think it's really human nature to feel defensive. I think it's really, you know, the norm for most of us when we feel like someone's saying something that is hard to hear. I think there's an element of sort of suspending that, or holding on, or being aware of that, rather than just responding. Because I think, much like, again, I think those who work with families and participants, there's something about really listening. The listening bit is the bit that is absolutely core to feedback, because in order to understand where someone's coming from, you have to hear them, and you have to be curious. So there's things that they aren't saying, but that might be underneath there as well, which is links to the graces, Azora, that you were flagging. And I do think there's something about the responsibility of all of us to hold that curiosity and that openness to listening at the heart when we're in the midst of it. And that's I think, again, as Laura says, an acknowledgement of it's really tough to give feedback, but there's also something about what you're going to get from it. It is going to be massively increased if you take the time to listen properly to what they're saying. So
I think also, can I just add as well in relation to that, because sometimes even when you're wanting to be very sensitive and attentive to possibly how the other person might receive that feedback, in fact, they have already made some assumptions about you, and they will be judging you in maybe your role or your own gender or your own race or whatever it might be. And I know that when I'm doing any feedback, I can't take responsibility for that person and how they might receive it. But I have a duty and responsibility on myself to make sure that I give it in as clear a possible fashion as I can. And I'm thinking, because I've got a cause of concern that I'm following through with a participant at the moment, because she's on the borderline of not meeting the 80% attendance at things. And when I've had the review meetings with her consultant social worker, she's giving all the body language as if she's engaging in the process, but she's not. You can tell she's just seeing this as a way of, it's a hoop that I have to jump through. And in my last meeting, I said, this is what I've observed about you. This is our 3rd meeting now. And you don't tend to enter into any dialogue. I'd like for you to think about that in order to help us, so that when we're coming to the 4th meeting, in order to sign this off, I can feel confident that you've really understood why we've had to take this course of action. So I had to kind of rest it with her rather than automatically challenging her, because I just knew that she wasn't in a place to want to receive it.
No, that sounds like a tricky situation, but a great example, Azora. Thank you. So I guess some general points around how we invite and encourage feedback. I think we've already touched a little bit about trying to make sure there's an openness from both sort of peers, from teams, and from your manager. I know that there's a great example that Josh often uses, and I know Anisha doesn't mind it, which is why I'm going to use it again, but that Anisha, who was the first line coordinator for coming up to 3 years, I think, by the time she left us. We observed a leadership group stock take. It was a SLT stock take at that point. And part of the role of the observer is to write up a little bit of a blurb on Teams afterwards about what happened in the meeting. And Anisha went to Enoshi and said that something that she'd noticed about the meeting, and Enoshi said, you need to talk to Josh. So Anisha, who was very quiet and would not normally have thought of going to Josh, did, and said to Josh, the way you managed that meeting felt really like you were privileging certain voices and not others. And Josh heard it in a way he hadn't, again, much like with Mehmet, different perspective, different lens, and sort of shared it and fed it back, and has absolutely since chaired the meeting in a different way. We still have to kind of occasionally say, hold on a minute, but it would have been much harder to do that if Anisha hadn't first made that point so clearly. So that's a great example of, openness all round, that the culture we absolutely want to create is a sense of anyone being able to talk to anyone about anything. So part of that is Josh being really clear and telling, sending clear messages, all of us, that's welcome. Thanking Anisha in the moment for having kind of flagged that with him, which I think was a bit hard for him to hear, but what he could appreciate was the fact that she'd been saying it to him. To really think about, in that moment, what you're doing with your body. Again, much like the CSW, clearly very good at the body language, not so good at the kind of follow through, but that idea of, everything you give will be information for that person, telling you something that's quite difficult. So really being careful about how you're responding. And again, back to the listening, but really absorbing, not just listening on a surface, like really kind of thinking about where that person might be coming from, and then going away and reflecting on it, and then changing something, because obviously we're back in that kind of loop of feedback, disappointment, and I can't remember those three middle points, but essentially if we're not changing our behaviours as a result of the feedback, then it's reflection instead of reflexivity. So I think there's something again about that, that in those instances where you might have to say something to someone 3 times, that's probably because it's a bit of more of a stuck place for them, and there'll be a reason for that. So the sort of patience and curiosity and to bring about change. And then, I think the bottom quote just sums it all up, really, that in that moment, everything you do will influence, and in that moment and beyond, everything you do will influence whether someone is willing to give you feedback again, and what they think about feedback more widely in the organisation. So it's pretty cool.
I think, just to wrap up, it sometimes it can feel a bit scary, and sometimes it can go wrong. When giving feedback, it can land the wrong way, and that's fine. I think what I would really encourage is, if it's landed the wrong way and you're on the receiving end of it, making the other person aware of it. Like Mary was saying, something that she said 3 months later, it was when she found out that was the case. But in the same way of kind of you giving somebody feedback, if you've felt that it hasn't kind of landed the right way, or that you've not taken what that person wanted from it, the other person will continue giving feedback in that way if they haven't also been made aware of that. And likewise, it's okay that you're not going to get it right every time. Some people are easier to give feedback to than others, much like you probably feel more comfortable in certain scenarios than others. And sometimes it might just not land the right way, but it's not a reason then just to kind of give up on giving feedback altogether, because that it will kind of get ourselves back into that narrative of falling down the little train of appreciation. Any thoughts, feelings? I think that's the last slide. Yes.
I just think for me, thinking about that, I try to kind of model taking responsibility, because that's that kind of thing where people get, defensive, which, as you say, Mary, is absolutely natural. And but when I'm kind of going into giving feedback, I'm just kind of thinking about a difficult conversation I have to have on Thursday with someone. There's things that I need to raise with them, but I'm also reflecting that I could have done things differently as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good.
So part of my plan is to kind of own that myself, and model that, that I'm taking responsibility for what I need to do differently, and hopefully that will model that to them as well. It doesn't always work, but that's how I try to do it. Yeah, because it's always a two-way thing, isn't there? And and I think when we're this is like CSWs in their first year, and everybody learns differently. And I kind of realised that I kind of bombarded this system with loads of written information, and that didn't
Not
land.
everybody's work,
Didn't so I'm going to take responsibility for that. I thought I was providing all the information that I needed to do, but it probably wasn't in the right format, and I could be defensive about that. I didn't have time. I thought I was being really helpful, but actually taking responsibility, I didn't do that right, and so this is where we are now. And that makes sense.
Different conversation. That's a great, it's a great point. Thank you.
That is the end of the session. We've finished exactly at 11:30. I'm sure you'll all be thrilled to hear. I will ask for your feedback on the session at some point in the next couple of days. But thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
And thanks for providing your examples, because it's a lot more interesting when it's kind of not just me telling you about things and the feedback I've been given.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.